Right, Roger. 40 years ago, 40, something very special happened for filmgoers around the world. Flash Gordon was released.
Flash Gordon. Now, Pascal, again, we might be accused of choosing a really, really old film, but let's just be honest with the listeners and the viewers just for a moment. You mentioned our good friend Mr. Richard Tubb earlier in the show. Before lockdown, we got together, didn't we? We hired an Airbnb. We often do this when the world isn't locked down. We hire a B&B. We spend the day helping each other out with our business. So it's almost like a mastermind. But then in the evening, we always have some fun. And we got a couple of bottles of wine. We got an Indian takeaway, and we watched Flash Gordon, and it was just such a fun night, wasn't it? I mean, it's a bit of a visually arresting film, very bright colours, a little bit garish, a little bit cheesy, very, very 80s, with the shoulder pads and the big hair and all of that sort of thing. But all three of us knew all the words, didn't we? And every time one of those immortal lines like "Gordon's alive," which was screamed by Brian Blessed, we were shouting it out as well and having a laugh, and that's why I thought that it would be good to talk about Flash Gordon, because it's one of those films, again, which has passed into legend. Now, Flash Gordon was originally a cartoon strip going way back to the 1920s and 30s, drawn and written by somebody called Alex Raymond. There were three film versions, actually there were film serial versions made in the 1930s starring somebody called Buster Crabbe, and they were obviously in black and white, and you used to go to the cinema every Saturday for 13 weeks to see a 20-minute episode of Flash Gordon. So it was already part of the mythos of science fiction across the world. And this film, made in 1980, as you say, I don't know how they managed it, but it was a miraculous combination of an amazing soundtrack by rock band Queen, visually stunning, as I've already said, very bright colours, very in keeping with the original flavour of the original comic strip and the 1930s version, so the rocket ships all look very similar, and well-known actors who have now passed into legend, like Brian Blessed and Timothy Dalton, and a bit of a cheesy script, I guess. It was, I sometimes didn't know whether it was trying to be too much comedy or too much drama, but they just seemed to hit the balance right. Just a great, fun film, which was science fiction that came out around the time, the world had got used to Star Wars. We'd had The Empire Strikes Back. That was quite a serious film. And then, bang, along comes Flash Gordon. And it was a great, fun film. And it's one of those ones that I could just watch time and time again, especially with a couple of decent buddies and a bottle of wine and a chicken curry takeaway.
I think you're right. If you were to read a summary paper or the juxtaposition of the vision about the music, the vision about the decor and the sets, the costumes, the acting and so on, this would not work. I mean, you look at the ingredients, you can go, this is a recipe for disaster. But the producer, Dino De Laurentiis, had a vision. And what is really, what I have a lot of respect is that they respected indeed, what's Flash Gordon, or the original Flash Gordon, in terms of the comic strip and the series. It would have been very tempting, and this is where the film marketing comes in for me, very tempting to look around what others are doing. And you're right, Empire Strikes Back had just been out. The world now was used to Star Wars as the reference point. It would have been very tempting to literally go, nah, let's not do Flash Gordon the way in which the authors back in the 20s and 30s wanted it. Let's do a Star Wars-like Flash Gordon. Very, very tempting. And part of my work usually as the content marketing consultant is to always remind people, get on with your vision and your craft. Don't spend your time looking around about what others are doing. They are too busy doing their thing. And the world doesn't need another Star Wars-like story. that's a journey. I mean, there's a link because you remember that George Lucas was obviously very much inspired by Flash Gordon because he'd been around watching the TV series. I'm not sure that that's truth or more kind of legend, but someone said he wanted to make Flash Gordon back in the days because he didn't have the right. He wrote Star Wars instead. I'm not sure about that, but that's part of it. But what is nice, we're mentioning about the cast in particular, there is a strong James Bond and a strong Star Wars, kind of influence because many of the actors and producers ended up working on James Bond movies or on Star Wars movies, years and years later. In terms of the marketing, certainly what they did well at the time was the timing. So let's not compete against the summer blockbusters. This was released in the end of year for the end of year festivities. For me, as an outsider, I would say that it's almost pantomime season. When this was released in the UK. As you know, Flash Gordon did very well in Europe, not so well in the US, which I'm wondering why, because ultimately the creators of Flash Gordon were Americans, am I right?
Yes, indeed. And maybe that was the whole point. Maybe it was the pantomime element that just hit the spot in Europe. I don't know whether they even do pantomimes in the United States, but perhaps, even though it was an American production, there was something remarkably British about it.
Yes.
Even though the guy who played Flash was an American, it had a very British vibe to it. Brian Blessed, archetypal Brit. Timothy Dalton played it just. He was so funny, but he was just that straight-laced sort of British hero, wasn't he? So it just had that vibe, and maybe that's why it didn't do well. But I think you're absolutely right, and it's a big lesson for us, is not to try and copy and be the same as everybody else. And you see this so much that somebody showed me a visual this week of a certain category of car, and basically they'd shown each model corresponding in that bracket for each of the main manufacturers, so BMW, Audi, blah blah blah, and they all look the same, apart from maybe that one's slightly more rounded here and a slightly more square there. And you think, come on, where's the innovation? Where's the being different? And I think Flash Gordon paints that lesson. It would have been so easy for them to have just done another Star Wars, but they went for that visual, outlandish visual look, the pantomime feel, and it absolutely worked.
What I will say is that also, which is, once you've committed to a vision, don't deviate again by being distracted by what others are doing. So when it came to the marketing, what they did do, which again is a surprise why it didn't work so well in the US, they had some very, very short trailers that were mimicking the comic strips. There was always like a very short action scene and a cliffhanger, royal cliffhanger, where sometimes Flash was hanging off a cliff. And so what they did for the film promotion, they took action scenes, but you didn't know how well Flash Gordon, the character, would fare and do. My friends in France went to see it before I did. They all came back from the cinema, and they all tell me about the scene where they had to put the hand inside the tree stump with that kind of scorpion-like creature. That's all they talked about.
Yeah.
So when I went, I was just waiting for the scene. And actually, even to this day, it's a kind of, probably primordial fear of putting your hand somewhere where you shouldn't and have some kind of creepy insect biting you. But it was so funny. That was all they mentioned of the whole film was this thing where someone has to put their hand, get stung, and die eventually. From what you can read, because there's so much been written by the film. I know it's been re-released this year in a very, very special 4K version and so on. It's going to be beautiful. But certainly, you mentioned Timothy Dalton. He went full on in the acting the character, and perhaps did him good for his career.
Absolutely right. And it's like the tree stump scene was so iconic. And of course, the actor that put his hand in and got bitten was one of the Blue Peter presenters. I always remember that, Peter Duncan. And so many things have become legendary. I mean, Sam Jones effectively reprised the role of Flash Gordon in the Ted film, with the talking teddy bear. And I went to see, I was at a dinner a couple of years ago, and Brian Blessed was the after-dinner speaker. And guess what he did? He was introduced, he walked up onto the stage, opened his mouth and shouted at the top of his voice, "Gordon's alive!" And that was how he started. And the audience just went absolutely crazy. And that was a one line that he uttered in a film 40 years ago, and he probably starts every single speech that he does to this day with those words. That's how ingrained they've become into legend. It's fabulous.
So, I would say to our viewers and listeners, if you've not seen Flash Gordon and you're not quite sure about what we're talking about, I highly recommend you watch it with a family. It's a great hoot. I suspect it's going to be on the big screen. I would like to think that in December this year, 40 years to the day of the release, there would be something very special. But again, it's about the vision, and I have to say, this is where for me, I take the message of, if you have a vision, stick with it. Even if around you there's some murmurs and some noise, it's not going to be quite right, because I can guarantee that it will find its audience. Roger, this has been episode 9. It's been an absolute pleasure. To our viewers and listeners, a big thank you for your ongoing support. If you'd like to subscribe and leave comments, please go to the usual places. I was Pascal Fintoni and he was Roger Edwards. Until next time, go out there and make sure your marketing is done right.